Welcome to the ACR Journals on Air podcast. I'm your host, Vicky Shamagam. Listeners, I want to take you back in time to late December 2020. It was a cold morning, and in the darkness, we all switched on the morning news shows and saw the same image. Trucks rolling out of a depot with snowflakes falling, glistening in the light of the truck headlights. There was a feeling of excitement and anticipation. Something the world had been waiting for was finally coming to fruition. Those trucks, of course, were carrying the first few doses of COVID vaccine from the Pfizer plant in Michigan to hospitals around the country and around the world. Some of us will remember seeing the first shipments arriving at our own hospitals, and many of us will remember that strange feeling of anticipation and trepidation as we wondered what this vaccine would cause in terms of side effects, both for us and for our patients. We have all, in our careers as rheumatologists, had this experience of prescribing a brand new medication for our patients. But this was different. Patients with our diseases had been excluded from the vaccine trials, and so we knew it was likely we'd only get information regarding the impact of the vaccines in patients with autoimmune disease from observational studies. Luckily, our forward-thinking colleagues at Washington University in St. Louis and the University of California at San Francisco were smart enough, even during those fairly tumultuous days of January 2021, to set up a study to get us that data. That study, of course, is the COVA-RAPID study, which is the COVID-19 vaccine response in patients with autoimmune diseases study. It is a prospective observational study of patients with chronic inflammatory disease, which includes our autoimmune diseases and also autoinflammatory disease, inflammatory bowel disease, and my favorite disease, hidradenitis suppurativa. And I'm excited that Dr. Monica Yang, the first author and one of the people behind this paper, is here with us to talk about her work. Monica is now a third-year rheumatology fellow at UCSF, and the title of her manuscript is Reactogenicity of the mRNA SARS-CoV-2 Vaccines, Associates with Immunogenicity in Patients with Autoimmune and Inflammatory Disease. There is a link to the article in our show notes from today. Welcome, Monica. It's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thanks so much for inviting me.
So, Monica, before we get deep into the data, I wonder whether you could share for our listeners, how did you get involved in this study as a fellow?
So even, as you were giving your introduction, it's just so crazy for me to think back and remember, just what a different state of knowledge we were in when this study started. Almost 2 years later now, we know so much about vaccines and vaccine safety. But, when the study was first starting, it was just when the first vaccine rollouts were beginning. And I think we got really motivated because we were just encountering, so many patient questions that we weren't able to answer, kind of, will these vaccines work for me? What will my side effect profile be? And will these vaccines be safe? So I think this is what motivated us to, get this study rolling and started. And then as a fellow, I think we were really much at the forefront of a lot of the COVID care for our patients. So, I had just kind of transitioned from residency where I was taking care of a lot of COVID patients. And I thought this was a great opportunity for me to, number one, get involved in translational research, but also, address a really kind of pressing, relevant question at the time. So I feel really lucky to be able to be part of this group.
No, it's great. And I was super impressed that you had gotten kind of really deep into it from the get-go. So this was obviously a very important study because we needed real world answers at that point in time. Many of us were asking questions. If our patients have underlying autoimmune disease, are they going to have more vaccine related symptoms? Is that a good thing, indicating better response to the vaccine? So tell me a little bit about the methodology of this study. Tell me how you recruited the patients and the timeframe of this study.
Yeah, so as you alluded to, this study was part of a larger work called COVA-RAPID, which was, a collaborative effort between us at UCSF and WashU. And, it was a large prospective observational study that was interested in, really assessing the immunogenicity on one hand, as well as the reactogenicity of the COVID-19 vaccines in our patients with chronic inflammatory diseases. So participants who had confirmed autoimmune diseases and healthy controls who were eligible to receive the COVID-19 vaccine at the time were recruited for the study. And eligible participants, they participated in 3 initial study visits. So there was a pre-vaccine visit, a visit after dose 1, and a visit after dose 2. And during those times, they answered questionnaires and gave blood samples. And for reactogenicity in particular, we collected adverse events within 7 days of each vaccine dose. And that kind of was consisted of, a graded symptom severity scale as well as individual symptoms in a list format. And then for the immunogenicity part, the anti-SARS-CoV-2 spike IgG antibody titers, those were quantified post-vaccination within 14 days of their kind of full vaccine series.
And just to confirm, all of the subjects in this study received mRNA vaccines. Was that correct?
Yeah.
Was there a rationale for which one, or was it patient choice or location dependent?
Yeah. So in retrospect, I think we did focus on the mRNA vaccines because at that time, they were novel and honestly, they were what was available to our patients initially. So in terms of which mRNA vaccine, I think that was really just what was reflective, of what was available at each center. As you mentioned, we started this enrollment December 2020. And I feel like at that time, we were kind of just getting whatever vaccine we could get.
Right. You got what you got and you didn't get upset, right?
Exactly. We just felt lucky to be getting a vaccine. So I think in that case, we were really agnostic. But I think that's the nice thing of, having these 2 centers that are in different locations, have different vaccination patterns. So I think we were able to kind of get a good mix of the different vaccines.
And then let's talk quickly about demographics, because you were trying to age and sex match your cases who had chronic inflammatory diseases with your control subjects, but it looks like that was not an easy task in this somewhat convenience-based cohort. So tell us how you addressed that during the analysis.
Yeah. So for Clovaripad, we really just tried to hit the ground running in terms of, when the vaccine started rolling out, enrolling really, any autoimmune patients who were qualified for a COVID-19 vaccine. And that meant that initially, we really were just enrolling people who were, able to get the vaccine. So those ended up being, higher risk individuals, a lot of healthcare workers, elderly patients. And then, over time, as our study grew, we were able to kind of expand our demographics. But yeah, as in a way to try to address that, in our analysis, we did multivariable modeling. We tried to adjust for age, sex, gender, as well as vaccine type to the best of our ability. But, as you'll notice in the paper, there were kind of site differences, demographic differences, but we still thought, it was important to get this information out there, even if kind of imperfect.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think we need real world information too. So I think it's still very helpful. In regards to the antibody response, I'm assuming that all got analyzed at a single lab. I'm assuming it was through a research lab. Could you tell us a little bit more about how that analysis was done?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, these anti-spike IgG antibodies, they were measured from the blood samples that were drawn kind of immediately after the second dose. They were all analyzed at WashU using an in-house ELISA that was developed by Dr. Ali Alabedi's lab, which, they've published previously. And, it's a little bit intricate in terms of the actual measurement, but the assay allowed us to basically calculate an EC50 for every participant, or, the concentration of the antibody that gives the half maximal binding. And, that allowed us to kind of have a standard measure across all participants. And it's what we report here in our work, as well as, our other paper involving mainly immunogenicity.
And then when you looked at the symptoms that people were getting post-vaccine, and I guess you call them adverse events from the vaccine in the paper, although I kind of think they were just vaccine symptoms.
Yeah.
Tell us what you found.
When we were collecting our reactogenicity data, we really wanted to kind of like mirror and measure, in a way that was relatable to kind of what was coming out for the general population. So trying to kind of, mirror the measurement that was reported in the phase 3 trials and like the VSafe database from the CDC. So for reactogenicity, we took a couple measures. We measured overall symptom severity after every dose on this ordinal scale from 0 to 4, with 0 being kind of no symptoms, 1 being mild or not interfering with activity, 2 was moderate or interfering with activity, and 3 being severe or, preventing daily activity. And then we also asked about individual symptoms, kind of in a list format of yes, no, and just the total number of symptoms. So, I think our main goals for this analysis were to, one, characterize the reactogenicity profile for patients with autoimmune diseases and compare that to healthy controls. So, when we did our analysis, we did find that patients with inflammatory diseases did have, more severe side effects following the first dose. But reassuringly, after full vaccination, after the second dose, there really was not a difference between the symptom severity and the number of symptoms between our patients with autoimmune diseases and our healthy controls. The symptoms that were most commonly reported included injection site pain, fatigue, headaches, and myalgias. So, this is just something we wanted our patients to be aware of.
And can you delve into that a little bit more and tell us about the relationship between different immunosuppressive medications and the vaccine-related symptoms? So as best I can understand, you didn't preemptively tell the patients to stop any of their immune suppressants. Do you know, did any of the patients do that? And if they did you analyze that piece separately? And then did you see differences between the different immune suppressants and symptoms experienced?
Yeah. So, that's definitely a really important consideration and a great question. So, as part of the study, as part of their kind of like pre-vaccine questionnaire, post-vaccine questionnaire, we did ask patients whether or not they held their medications, prior to vaccination. I will say, though, at the time of our initial study enrollment, there really were not any formal guidelines regarding, whether to hold medications, especially, methotrexate and abatacept. And really the recommendation from the ACR task force, which I feel like, is very generally accepted and we're all following now, was actually made after a lot of these participants finished their initial series of the mRNA vaccine. So actually, when we, looked back at the responses, a vast majority of the patients reported in this study, did not hold their medications kind of post and peri-vaccine. Obviously, moving forward, in our future studies, I think that's definitely something we're taking into account, especially as we look at both reactogenicity and immunogenicity. But when it comes to kind of the specific, we tried to look at both specific diseases and specific medications in terms of reactogenicity. But I will say, I think we probably did not have, enough numbers to make these strong conclusions about these subgroups. But, when we looked at medications, for example, I think there were kind of hints that, there were associations. For example, methotrexate had the strongest adjusted association with increased symptom severity following vaccination, while other agents such as, the B cell depleting agents and the TNF inhibitors actually demonstrated, more protective effects to certain symptoms. Now, I think whether that's, reflective of maybe the patient's underlying disease and disease state versus, the medications alone, I think, that's still unclear and we need to study. But I think this was maybe a good, first step of saying, there may be effects from the medications that we should study in a larger patient population.
Definitely. And I guess getting to the meat of the paper now, when you paired the post-vaccine symptom data with immunogenicity data, that's kind of where you found strong relationships. So tell us about those findings, because I thought those were very interesting.
Yeah, exactly. So, I think our motivation for doing this type of analysis is in terms of looking at this relationship between immunogenicity and reactogenicity was because, I think the hypothesis out there, and it kind of, makes sense that the more symptomatology you have, perhaps of the more robust vaccine response you're going to have. But I feel like that really hasn't yet been borne out in the general population. And, in terms of just thinking of why, I think an immunocompetent host they've demonstrated has, a really robust vaccine response. So I think it might be harder to kind of tease out vaccine differences versus in our immunocompromised patients, we've demonstrated that there is a subgroup who do have a blunted immune response. So we might be able to detect, a stronger relationship or a difference between kind of reactogenicity and immunogenicity. So essentially, we looked at the number of symptoms that was reported after the full vaccination and the antibody titers post-vaccination. And what we found was that in patients with autoimmune diseases, for every increase in one endorsed symptom, there was an associated increase of 15.1% increase in antibody titer in our model. And what was interesting is when we actually broke down the individual symptoms, experiencing fever and fatigue after the vaccination were actually associated with the greatest increase in antibody titer.
So I guess what you're telling us is that old adage of no pain, no gain holds especially true for patients with immune diseases receiving the mRNA COVID vaccine.
Yeah, it's exactly.
And I kind of wonder whether we should actually use that to reframe how we explain this to our patients, because I think, these symptoms are not really side effects or adverse reactions to the vaccine. They're really a sign that the vaccine is doing its job and working. So maybe we should recall them as vaccine-associated symptoms rather than side effects.
No, I think you make a great point. Yeah. I mean, kind of reframe this thought of it being an adverse event as opposed to just, the vaccine working. I think that's a great point.
And so tell me where you're planning to take this work moving forwards. Is anyone continuing to follow these patients longitudinally and see whether those antibody titers correlate to infection risk? And certainly, whether or not people get sick from the COVID infection? And then are you looking at all at booster doses in these patients and whether they had similar vaccine-related symptoms or better antibody responses in the future booster doses?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So yeah, I think, the amazing part about this study is, I think our vaccine practices are continuing to evolve and we're trying to, continually keep up with that. I feel like this study at the time was very novel, but, we've obviously changed a lot about our vaccine practices. The study was just looking at the initial vaccine series of the first 2 doses, but we've continued to follow, a majority of our patients and they're at their 3rd and now, even 4th dose of vaccine. So I think it'll be really interesting, even just from a reactogenicity standpoint, to see how those vaccine effects and side effects turn out and see, perhaps is there a link with their initial antibody response to further down. So I think that's definitely something we're looking at. And then I think there's a lot of exciting things happening, from the immunogenicity side perspective, in terms of breakthrough COVID infections, as well as, T cell immunity. And, this is a population that's continuing to change. And I'm really excited to see, what this research, ends up evolving into.
So it sounds like we can be looking forward to more data coming out from your group on those important questions, which I think really are important to all of us as we move forward.
Yes, exactly.
So Monica, that was fabulous. I want to thank you for joining us on the ACR Journals on Air podcast today and for walking us through your incredibly important work. Thank you.
No, thank you so much for having me.
So Monica has told us the story behind this paper, but I also wanted to ask the editor of Arthritis Care and Research about the editorial process for this manuscript. I want to welcome Dr. Mayo Danila to the show. Mayo is an associate professor at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. She is also an associate editor of Arthritis Care and Research. Welcome to the show, Mayo.
Hello, Vicky, and it's very good to talk to you today. Thank you for the invitation to join your podcast.
So Mayo, would you mind sharing with our listeners a little bit of background about your role as an associate editor at ACNR and how long you've been an associate editor and what your pathway was to that role?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So in summer of 2020, Dr. Kelly Allen from University of North Carolina reached out to me and said that she was preparing an application to serve as editor-in-chief for the Arthritis Care and Research. and she invited me to join her team. And I was very excited about the opportunity because I had been a frequent reviewer for the journal for a number of years. And prior to that, I served on editorial boards of other journals. So this was a good opportunity for me to learn more about the process of being an associate editor. I think that my experience on the ACR's Quality of Care Committee, in which role I helped review a variety of ACR guidelines, help prepare me for this particular role. So you asked how long I've been doing this. So the application went in somewhere in 2020. We started sort of in a learning basis in early 2021 and officially since July 1st of 2021.
Great. So you're now seasoned, I guess, and seasoned through the review process during COVID, which I'm sure was an experience.
Yes, it has been, and but it's been great. I mean, the team that I've joined is phenomenal. There is fantastic expertise all around, and it's really good to meet new people and learn from so many experts in the field.
And it sounds like for our listeners, if they're interested in becoming more involved, really the pathway should be accept all those invitations to review manuscripts and volunteer, 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 it sounds like.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think that it also helps build somebody's career profile, and during the promotion pathway, it's good to have a background in reviewing and editing manuscripts. So particularly for junior investigators and junior academicians, I truly, truly recommend to get on, to accept, as you said, as many invitations to review as they feel that that's their area of expertise.
Yeah, and I'm sure you feel similarly. I feel like those opportunities always help me be a better writer as well. So they do kind of, although it's work and work of an academic, it does help you with skill growth yourself. So it has a double reward.
That's exactly right. I think you get better at writing. You get to know the field very well too. And because you get to see papers before they actually make it to the publication, and it offers the ability to learn from others' writing style. It's like reviewing grants, very similar.
Yeah, absolutely. And can you describe for our listeners a little bit about the process by which a manuscript gets assigned to you? How do you then pick it up and nurture the manuscript through that pathway of reviews, revisions, and ultimately, hopefully, to acceptance?
Yeah, sure. So Laura Bolte is our excellent managing editor, and we use a system to manage the manuscripts or the process. So she receives all new submissions, and then she assigns them to Dr. Kelly Allen, and from there, Kelly may assign or reassign papers to the deputy editors, who are Todd Schwartz from UNC and Sam Lim from Emory. Because she may have conflicts, for example, and she may not, she can't really assign the manuscript to the associate editor, and then the associate editors get assigned manuscripts based on their area of expertise or an interest. So, for example, I would get papers on osteoporosis, on telehealth, which are my main focus in my research, and then I take a look at the manuscript. I first look at the abstract and just make sure that the abstract would be of interest to our readership at ACNR. And after that, if I think that this is something of interest to our readers, if based on my knowledge of the field, I think that this is novel enough and interesting enough, I would assign reviewers. The reviewers are assigned based on what their area of expertise is too. And we have information on Scholar One, which is our system in which manuscripts are managed. And it's very important for the authors to actually give us names of reviewers. All the time a manuscript spent in review depends fantastically on our ability to get people to review them. People are very busy. They may not have time to review a manuscript. So sometimes it takes a week or 2 weeks to actually get potential reviewers to accept the invitation for review. And then we give the reviewers a few weeks to provide us with their comments and suggestions for the authors. And I get the manuscript back with the reviews rather. And then based on the reviews, as you know, the reviewers may recommend manuscript to be accepted with the revision or recommend rejection. We decide whether or not this manuscript will go forward to actually give an opportunity for the authors to revise their work. And the process may be repeated once or twice, and then the manuscript gets accepted or rejected.
Any tips for our authors on some of those more challenging reviews? So, for example, how would you recommend a author perhaps respond to a challenging reviewer too, who wants a year's more work costing, $500,000? How can a poor author respond to those comments?
Yeah, I mean, I think as an author, or an investigator, we believe in our work. And it's very, the step of publication is just the last step in this long process of getting the work funded and then getting it performed. So sometimes we get reviews that are hard for us to stomach. And I think at the end of the day, it's about resilience and not giving up on your own work, on what you think it's interesting, and how important you think your contribution is to the field. So sometimes the reviewers may not have read it, may have missed a statement or two that we made in a manuscript, or sometimes it's not clear enough and they just ask for clarifying language. I mean, I think it's okay to say, I'm sorry. You don't say I'm sorry in a paper, but you say, you state that as a limitation. I wasn't able to do X, Y, and Z because we weren't able to collect this information for this particular study. And I think that's fine. And in my experience, reviewers are reasonable. So they would, they understand that an author doesn't have to necessarily accept all the recommendations that they as a reviewer made.
And as an associate editor, do you have any tips for people submitting to your journal, things to do specifically, or perhaps more importantly, things that we should avoid to smooth the review and revision pathways?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is to make sure that the keywords are that the manuscript has that one gives to the manuscript are appropriate, because that helps sort of streamline the process, in that the appropriate associate editor is assigned, and then the appropriate reviewers are assigned as well. And it's important to also make sure that the abstract reflects the content of the manuscript, that it's read first, and it's what we see as editors first. So if you make a good impression, the deal is almost going on your favor, if you will. The other thing that is very important, especially these days when people are very busy and they are pulled in many directions and the bandwidth is really limited, it's for the authors to provide us with a list of potential reviewers. You'd be surprised how many times, we get the names and I know those people, for example, from their work, and I asked them to review and they decline because they are too busy. So giving us more options allows us to decrease the time to review if the manuscript is going to go through the review process.
And so are the authors supposed to check with those people first, or you just recommend suggesting names of people that you know are active in the particular field that your work is positioned in?
No, I don't think that you're supposed to check with the reviewers, particularly since we have to be making sure that there are no conflicts, right? But I do think that providing more than just a couple of names is helpful, and just making sure that those people are actually active in that space.
Yeah, definitely. And then circling back to this manuscript that we've been discussing today about the COVID vaccines, give us some insights of what stood out to you the first time you kind of were assigned this manuscript, anything that you want our listeners to know about this particular manuscript as you nurtured it through its review process.
So I think, we all know that concerns about the side effect profiles of vaccines in general and novel mRNA vaccines in particular are an important contributor to vaccine hesitancy. And I think this particular work makes a very good argument about the relationship between reactogenicity and the immunogenicity to mRNA vaccines. So I think this particular paper informs the field on a topic that there hadn't been work done prior to this investigative team taking on this topic. So it also provides us with ability to say to our patients, to bring it to clinic and to say to our patients, look, if you have severe side effects like, myalgias, it's not a good thing in terms of how you feel that time, but it may mean that your body is actually going through the process of creating those helpful antibodies and protecting you from a severe disease such as COVID-19.
Yeah, and it must have been exciting as an editor to be sort of one of the first people looking at this manuscript, I would think.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, I work in this space, and I think it was really exciting to see that, in a relatively short period of time, this group of investigators from Washington University and UCSF were able to do this work.
Yeah. Kudos to them, right?
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Mayo. That was really great, very insightful for our listeners, both specific to this manuscript and then your just really helpful general tips. We appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you. It was great to be with you, Vicky.
This episode, I want to give credit to Joe Rojas, who joined ACR just a few months ago as a senior specialist podcast program manager and got this show up and running. It's been a pleasure working with him. He is helpful, efficient, and kind. Thank you all for listening to our show. ACR Journals on Air is a production of the American College of Rheumatology. Please rate and subscribe to our podcast at acronair.org or wherever you get your podcasts.